Grace and peace, y'all. It's good to be with you in worship again. I'm just going to own, before I go any further, that this is maybe the sixth time that I have tried to record this particular talk. And I keep getting into it, and then I kind of I'm finding myself anxious or second guessing myself or up in my head. And the truth is just that it's a talk that matters to me. And you'll catch on pretty quickly that there's some pretty clear resonances for me and what I'm going to talk about. But it's not about me, and it's not even just about the community, one of the many communities through which I identify that will come up in this, but it's about this larger extension of the table. About what it means to practice and live into the radical welcome that the Jesus message is about. So our passage today comes from Acts, starting in chapter 8, around verse 26. Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go toward the south, toward the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road." And so he got up and went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to this chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it, and hearing him read the prophet Isaiah, he said, "Do you understand what you are reading?" He replied, "How can I unless someone explains it to me?" And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. Now the passage of the scripture that he was reading was this: "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. And his humiliation justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." The eunuch asked Philip, "About whom, may I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else?" Then Philip began to speak. And starting with the scriptures, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" He commanded the chariot to stop. And both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. So let's start out with talking a little bit about why we would be reading from the book of Acts right now. And that's a little bit about sort of the lectionary and how the lectionary is structured. During the time between Easter and Passover, or between Easter Sunday and Passover Sunday, the lectionary takes a slight deviation, where there's typically an Old Testament text and a New Testament text and an epistle and a psalm. During this season, instead of the Old Testament text, there's a text from Acts each week. So alongside of those gospel stories of what happens after Jesus comes back around and the reappearances, all of those stories that you've been hearing from us over the last few weeks, there's also these stories about the beginning of the Jesus movement, about the folks that started building what would become the church during the time after Jesus has ascended. So it includes the apostles, but then there's this other group of folks, the deacons, that were ordained to go out and bear witness to this message, to the good news of Jesus. And that good news is that where there was death, there is life. There is a new way being born, and we are called into practicing that resurrection. It's important, too, to remember that Acts is an extension of the Gospel of Luke. And Luke's presiding occupation, kind of throughout the stories of Luke, is this sort of ever-expanding idea of the table. The table is Luke's favorite metaphor. Jesus is always at dinner parties, always hanging, and the dinner parties never were constituted by the social conventions that seemed that they should have dictated them. there's always this thing of going, there's space for more people. Let's continue to broaden the horizons of who's in the group. Everyone is welcome here. And that's the core message again. Here in Acts, this sort of second part of Luke. It's sort of like Luke, the sequel. In Acts, we're getting these same messages as told through those early folks who were going out and spreading the word and sharing the story beyond just their local community. So Philip is one of those deacons. And it's important to note that in the story right before this, we get word that Philip is in Samaria. And that's not insignificant. Samaria, as you might remember from the story of the Samaritan woman or of the Good Samaritan, the relationship between the Hebrew folks and the Samaritans is tense. And it's tense in that kind of way that two folks that come from the same basic heritage but kind of took different paths and then found themselves living next door to each other might be tense. The Samaritans are Abrahamic. They consider themselves descendants of the Abraham tradition. They have their own version of the Torah, but there's wrestling about both theological but really more ethnic wrestling because they were kind of mixed with Assyrians, and so there's these two different kind of trajectories as ethnic groups that then theology sort of becomes theology and politics becomes the place that they play out their tensions. So it's important to get Philip, who's probably from Caesarea, but we're not 100% sure. Not really sure about his class background. Most of Jesus's followers were working class rural folks, but he's from Caesarea, which is kind of where the Romans hang out. So could have been a more middle class kind of follower that got word of this message. Anyway, he's from one community and he is finding himself across the line. He's called into cross-community work. So that's what's going on before this story even starts, is that he's been in this place where he is already pushing the boundaries of who he knew himself to be, right? To be in conversation with the other. To say, hey, out of this root of our shared traditions, there is a new version that's growing. This rabbi, this teacher, is showing us out of, not in opposition to, but out of our sacred stories. There's a way of reading these that's about an ever-expanding love and justice narrative. So he's called into that and called across community lines to do that work. So he's already been stretching himself. Right? He's already been redefining who he is in relation to who he was taught the other might be. And on his way out of town, he bumps into this unnamed character, the Ethiopian eunuch. So, what we know about the Ethiopian eunuch is that they're a foreigner. They have a different racial and ethnic identity. They would be also not conforming to the gender norms of either Roman or Hebrew culture, right? So the definition of eunuch that we understand, that sort of very technical definition that we would hear in a contemporary language, only catches a part of who the eunuch, of what the term eunuch meant in the cultural context that this text comes from. So eunuchs included a wide range of folk who their common denominator was that they didn't conform to prescribed gender roles. So it could include folks who were intersex, who were something that we might think of in contemporary language as something like trans. It could also refer to folks who partnered exclusively with people of the same sex, so something that we might think of in our contemporary language as gay or lesbian. So it's it's a whole variation. And I want to be really careful because all of those other words are contemporary language, and it wouldn't have even been understood the same way. So we always have to be careful when we read back into that. But the important piece is to get that this was a gender non-conforming person. right? And they were showing up in this space as outside of the laws of gender and sexuality, and yet they had figured out how to navigate that identity, either claimed or born into or put onto them, to find some sort of status. So they're part of the Ethiopian court, because there was space for them to, and in a way that's actually really tied up into a lot of really complicated stuff around sexism, that they could have a place within the court as sort of a guardian of the queen, right? This idea that there might be somebody that is in between genders, that can hold some protective role, but wouldn't be a threat to really a sexual threat, or a gendered threat, to that sort of protective nature. So there's something really that's messy about that, but it's important to get that the Ethiopian had some status and probably had some wealth, but it was a provisional status. So it was a status that even their access to was based in their otherness. So there's interesting power dynamics going on here. In some ways, Philip is more a part of the community where the Ethiopian is finding themselves now, and yet the Ethiopian probably has more economic status, is clearly someone that can read. So there's some, it's a mix of power dynamics going on, but there's a whole lot of otherness, So it's also really important to get that the Ethiopian eunuch would have been excluded from the temple culture, right? So there would be prohibition. So though they came to Jerusalem to go to the temple, they're sitting outside, and they're trying to read on their own and to make sense of these sacred texts on their own. They wouldn't have been allowed. They would have been seen as ritually impure. So the Spirit calling Philip to go to this person has another layer, right? Both about transgressing these racial, ethnic lines, transgressing these gender norms, but also transgressing this culture of religious purity. And it's to that person that Philip is called. And Philip, offers what Philip has to offer. Philip's resources are his experience of Jesus and of the teachings of Jesus and the lived witness of Jesus, to a way of understanding God and humanity, and the nature of creation and community. It's grounded in this tradition, but with this message of love and hope and peace that's extending beyond those tribal boundaries. But it's important to note here that it's the eunuch who seizes onto this message of welcome. There's this really bold question. What is it to stop me from being one of you? What is it to stop me from being part of this movement, from giving my life to this movement? Me, the other, the immigrant, the gender variant, the employee of this outside kingdom. What is it to stop me? And we get no words from Philip. We only get action. What we get is this image of the two of them jumping into the water together. So our first reading here is focused on the eunuch and their outsider status, their empowered sense of self in light of hearing the good news of the Jesus message. But there's another word here for us. And the best way I can think about this is to say that Philip may well be the patron saint of allies. So let's look at what he does. He follows the Spirit towards one who is excluded, but curious. He offers his resource, his experience. He abandons himself and literally gets on board for the eunuch's journey. He disrupts his own thinking. He's willing to be seen in public, noticeably running through town with this outsider. He follows the eunuch's lead as the eunuch learns how to tell their own story in relation to the Jesus story, how to claim their own place within the Jesus movement. And then there's this disappearance. It's important to note that it kind of mirrors the disappearance of Jesus in the Emmaus story, that upon being recognized, then sort of disappears and shows up miles and miles away in another place. So part of this is linking the apostles and the deacons into this larger movement, right? This movement of the Spirit that is there, and that presence exists not just in this way that's bound by space and time. That what the eunuch is joining into, they're now a part of this bigger network, this bigger movement. But it's also this really interesting move because it decenters Philip. That the story isn't just about Philip and Philip's action. Philip is consistently following the eunuch's action, and even towards the end, Philip is literally ripped from the story. It ends with, he saw him no more and went out on his way rejoicing. We can't know for sure what that eunuch went on to do, but we can know that that eunuch had the experience of somebody that was the insider in a community, standing with them and inviting them in, offering them their resources, and then getting out of the way and trusting that their experience and their interpretation of their experience of God was going to be valid, and that Spirit would be with them, and that they were going to be networked in this larger sense of church that was beyond time and space, and they could let go and trust that person to do their own work and to be on their own journey. Tradition has it that this eunuch goes on and starts the church in Ethiopia. And then later, there are folks' versions of it tell all kinds of stories about who this figure may have been. And there's maybe some ways of trying to connect historical documentation and gospel scriptures, and all of that gets messy. But the point is that the eunuch went away rejoicing, not feeling abandoned. They had been well resourced. They had received what they needed from Philip. And then they went on rejoicing, having experienced God in the ways that Philip had experienced God, having experienced the story of Jesus in the presence of the Spirit. So, what's it mean for us? Because in all of us is both Philip and the eunuch. In all of us is the ally and the otherized, the one excluded and the one welcomed home. But let's not pretend that all the stories are the same. Let's not forget that we know Philip's name. But the primary actor in this story, the primary actor in this play, is only known by their status. The Ethiopian eunuch. And any of us that carry a status that's an otherizing status, live with this fear that we become only known by that status, because it can loom so large in the stories about us. So for all of those whose names we don't know, who dared to ask, what's to keep me from being a part of this justice love movement of the Spirit? What's to keep me from being one of you? What's to keep me from being baptized? For all of those who were met with anything less than Philip jumping into the water with them, we remember you. And if that's you, if you're one of those who for whatever reason was ever denied the fullness of your place at God's table, or ever had somebody to try and strip that from you, whatever they said to you, they were wrong. They were not speaking for God. This story, this biblical story, this scriptural story, this is your story. And so, friends, you all are welcome here. And all of you is welcome here.
Higher than the yonder mountain, deeper than the sea. From the breath of the east on to the west is the love. Started with the sea, stronger than the wildest horses and the rising tide. The cords of death hung so heavy on our between forever and the passing days. There's a place moth and rust cannot lay waste. This is grace, the face of love.